Thank you for joining us today. My name is Brad Miller, and this is the Chronically Human Podcast, where we have discussions aimed at creating a better world with more freedom and less suffering. Today, our guest is Tom the Tank Egan, former UFC fighter and now one of the best mixed martial arts trainers in the world. We have an excellent conversation about fighting, freedom, culture, and personal responsibility. Hope you enjoy. Thank you, Tom Egan, for being on the Chronically Human Podcast. This is Brad Miller, and how are you been?
All good, man.
That's
Excited
great.
excited to be on the podcast.
Well, I appreciate you being here. What we do on the podcast here is we look to have conversations that advance individual freedom and also help to eliminate unnecessary suffering in the world. So I think your story really falls into that, man. Before we get into
Amen.
that, did you get a chance to watch the UFC Brooklyn fight? And what do you think about Cejudo and the TJ fight specifically?
Yeah, I had a chance to. I unfortunately was late getting into the card only because I was trying to set up my ESPN Plus thing and my Apple TV was messing over big time. So I jumped in on the card a little late, but I managed to see the last couple of fights. But I mean, of course, the Cejudo fight was the one that was most attractive to me, and actually, I thought I wrote on Twitter right before the fight when they were getting into the ring. I tweeted that I had Cejudo winning by decision, because I thought the skills he displayed against Anthony or against Mighty Mouse were pretty impressive. His wrestling, the way he was able to mix it up from his striking to his wrestling, I thought it was very impressive. He didn't show many signs of gaps or weaknesses in that performance. So I had him going in, especially with the momentum and everything that he had built up. And I did honestly, even though TJ had said that the weight cut didn't really hurt him, I honestly did think that weight cut was, could have somewhat of a significant impact in the outcome of the fight, because going from 135 pounds ripped to death lean to going all the way down to 125, that's a big jump. It's 10 pounds. It's not like you went from 35 to 30, or like in boxing the way they'll go from like 54 to 48, or 54, 52, 51. I don't know. It was like 10 pounds. So I thought it'd be a big thing. And then the second the fight opened with Cejudo being aggressive, coming forward, that open palm approach, dropping big strikes, and then I thought Cejudo got off very, very fast, and I think Dillashaw sometimes needs a little bit of a slower start to do his funky moves, and I think like if you look at the Brandel or the Henan Barrel fights, he kind of took his time, got into it, and as the fight went on, started to dominate. But I think Cejudo came out quick. He's got that nice compact style, the same as those Olympic caliber wrestlers come out. They come out quick and hard, and they need to score. So, and then the second they kind of engaged and he shoved TJ to the ground, I was like, whoa, what the hell's going on here? And then of course he landed that big kick, and I wasn't after he shoved him, I was like, something's weird here. And even though TJ came out and said that he was fine, I think that's just the champion in him. He's a champion mentality. Mm-hmm. He's a fighter. And I don't fully think that maybe he understood maybe the impact that the weight cut had on him. I never understood why he wanted to go down to such a small weight. Like going up is always obviously easier on your body, but going down like that and not really giving up much size and strength, if you know what I mean. It's not like he went down and he was towering over the guy, or like
Cejudo looked bigger to me. Cejudo looked like the bigger fighter.
Cejudo looked like the more of a man in there. So it was kind of, personally, if I was managing, if I was training TJ Dillashaw and that fight was being looked to happen, I'd be like, screw going down, man. Let him come beat him, and then you go up to the 45s. Why go down? It just blew my mind. And I've met TJ in person multiple times, and he has a bit of meat on him. It's not like he's a skinny dude. He has a bit of meat on him, and I don't know, it baffled me why they made him work. Now, mind you, he did his job. He's a professional. He got down to the weight, and he's a professional. You can't take that away from him. I love TJ because he's willing to test himself, and even though he lost that fight, I still think there's a lot of credit to go TJ's way, given that he took the fight, was game, showed up on weight, well, did everything right, and unfortunately it didn't go his way. Do I think the stoppage was a bit fast? I know that referee, Kevin McDonald. He's a great guy. I think he's definitely one of the best referees in the game. He's refereed some of my fights. He's refereed a couple of my fights. One fight in particular, I remember I had a guy back mounted, and I was just pounding on him, and he let it go for a little bit and made sure that I had my finish. Versus I think this time around maybe he jumped the gun a little fast. I don't know if the weight cut thing was something that maybe was whispered in his ear before the fight. Protect TJ. He's already cut a lot of weight. I don't think people are bringing that into a factor, that maybe the referee had to jump in to stop the fight for the sake of the fact that TJ had cut a lot of weight to get down. I know Dana White wasn't very, he didn't really like the decision. I can imagine as a promoter, you want to see a fight go a little bit longer.
Right.
I was kind of alluding to the fight between Frankie Edgar and Gray Maynard, those two fights that were
wars.
Frankie,
they were awesome.
But in the beginning of the fight, Frankie was almost out. He was like literally, depending on the referee, that fight could have been stopped. Both of those fights. And one fight he defended his title, and then the third fight, it was the second fight he had stopped Gray from taking his title because they called it a draw, and then the third fight he fucking came back. Excuse my language.
You're fine.
He came back. He came back and stopped him. And to think that maybe his belt could have been taken away from him had that fight been stopped. And watching that replay multiple times, I do think TJ was rattled. I do think he was rocked, but it looked like he was still moving. I think give him a chance to maybe fight back. But like I said, Kevin McDonald probably had in his mind, this guy's cut 10 extra pounds that maybe he didn't need to cut. And maybe 10 years from now, TJ will look back on that fight and say, you know what, thank God he did actually stop that fight, because I could have suffered some significant brain damage. Because that's what happens when you get dehydrated.
Mm-hmm.
It affects the nerve endings in your brain and stuff like that, and that doesn't always repair. And then when you get dehydrated and you're getting hit, you're causing significant nerve damage that people are not quite aware of. It's starting to become a much more popular topic amongst athletes to talk about, which I think is very important. One of my favorite wrestlers, female wrestler, her name's Helen Maroulis. She was the first Olympic gold for the U.S. Olympic team. She took her gold, I believe it was in Rio, and she's poor thing has to stop competing now due to concussion effects on her brain that maybe a lot of people wouldn't assume would come with wrestling.
Right.
However, with her, the female wrestler, such a dominant wrestler as well. Like I said, she took gold, first women's Olympic gold for the US wrestling team, and she has to stop competing now. And she put up a post recently on her Instagram, quotes from different athletes speaking out about concussions and the effects that they have, and that not every concussion is the same.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you can have one concussion where you don't even know you have a concussion, and you can have another concussion where, you've had maybe slight memory loss in the moment. Just last week, I believe I suffered somewhat of a concussion. I was wrestling, and I, in the middle of a scramble, I had taken the guy down, and I went to take his back to score points, and he went to stand up, and the bottom of my chin hit the back of his head, and I remember getting rocked, and then I stayed wrestling. I didn't think anything of it, and I continued the session, trained everything, and then the second the workout ended, and I got dressed, and I was right before I was about to leave the gym, all of a sudden I was having these like weird deja vus of dreams that I had, and I couldn't shake it. I was like, what the hell's going on here? And then all of a sudden, like, I'd forgotten, basically where I was going, what was going on. I had called my girlfriend, completely forgot what I talked to her on the phone about. I had to call her again. I had opened up my social media, my Instagram and my Facebook, and I was looking at comments that I had written earlier on in the day, and I didn't remember writing them.
Wow, that's crazy.
So that's a little scary, and that happened to me just last week. And I try to be particularly cognizant of protecting myself in my training, especially my fighters that I'm training right now. We only do one, maybe two big sessions a month where we go and we put the headgear, the big gloves, the shin pads, the mouthpiece. We put all the protection gear on. but I let the guys go all out, and I noticed over time, we've had low levels of injuries, low risk. It's a low risk training method, meaning, we're not necessarily getting pounded on every week. A lot of gyms nowadays, they still do the repeated heavy sparring weekly, week in and week out. And that's where athletes, particularly fighters, are getting their brain damage. I mean, I always tell people that Muhammad Ali, fair enough, he had Parkinson's disease, which is a genetic disorder, but it was, certainly brought on faster by boxing.
It didn't
But
help him.
I would go as far as saying that it wasn't the Frazier fights and the Foreman fights that gave him that brain damage that slowed his speech. I would say it was the training and preparation leading up to it, because if you watch some of the footage of his, like, the Rumble in the Jungle, the footage leading up to the Foreman fight, he's preparing himself with that rope a dope. He's taking punishment in the ring. He's kind of doing sparring, 3, 4, 5 times a week, putting in all these rounds with these heavy hitters, taking these shots, and then he gets to the fight and he's used to taking them, but it's still wearing it on your body. And so going back to where I was talking about all this, I do maybe think that perhaps the referee, someone had said something to him, or maybe he had it in his own mind thinking, because like I said, Kevin McDonald is a phenomenal referee. I see him all the time up here in the New England local circuits. Anytime he's reffing a fight for one of my fighters, I'm very happy that he's the one in there. He's very knowledgeable. He does let fights go to their best potential, lets them go. But maybe this time around he said, well, TJ took a lot of hits, a lot of significant shots on his way down, and maybe he was in a little bit of an autopilot mode, and then he gets up and he's fully aware. But like I said last week, I had a thing happen to me where my chin got hit, and then I went on, did the whole session, and then next thing you know, before I knew it, I'm like, literally, I'd say about half hour, 45 minutes after I'd gotten my chin banged by the back of my partner's head, my wrestling partner's head, I had a hard time remembering what the hell happened that whole day. Wow. So maybe TJ doesn't fully understand or isn't fully aware right now the stoppage. I know he's thinking about the opportunity and what he had taken away from him, the opportunity for a belt and all this. But, I mean, is that really worth it when you're 60, 70 years of age and you're drooling out of the side of your mouth? You know what I mean?
Right. What do you think of TJ's response afterwards? Do you think that was part of him getting basically knocked out, that he came off a little bit not in a great way as far as him talking about it being taken away from him? I can't imagine what it's like to be in the octagon like that, but you've got experience in there. After a fight like that, do you think anybody should be interviewed? I know he wanted to talk and it wasn't Anik pushing it.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. I've often heard Joe Rogan talk about that, about fighters being interviewed in the ring. I think it's cool to interview the fighters in the ring. I know that as a fighter that you look forward to that moment where you get to say say your piece in the ring. Even though when I fought in the UFC, even though I had lost my fight and I did suffer a concussion that night, but I still remember after the fight, I still had my wits about me. I didn't make any excuse. I just said, right, I'll be back and I'll get my stuff together and I'll do it next time. But it was certainly a phenomenal moment watching Joe Rogan come up to you with that mic and you get to say your little piece. But I think, okay, maybe that's cool, but I don't think we should hold what fighters say in the ring immediately against them later on. I think whatever they say, I think let them have their little moment in the ring because it's part of the fight. Every fighter looks forward to win or loss. I'm sure a lot of fighters love to have that, particularly if you're a crowd favorite. Like in my case, I was, and I got to say my little piece to the crowd. I said thank you to the crowd in Gaelic, and the whole crowd kind of loved it and whatever. And that was cool. I could take that with me, even though I didn't get the win. But I think whatever you say in the ring, particularly if it happens to be somewhat controversial, kind of like what TJ was talking about, saying that Cejudo didn't beat him.
Right.
I don't think that should be held against him. Number one, he's a competitor. He wants to win. And you can't always – everyone's not always in the perfect frame of mind in that moment. Maybe he still does believe what he says now. Maybe he doesn't. But I don't think we should hold what they say in the ring against them, considering that they literally just went through a fight. And like I said, God knows what happens in there. Like I said, I was just wrestling, and the guy went to stand up, and my chin got hit. I didn't think anything of it. And then later on, I realized, holy shit, that actually had a bit of a significant impact on me that I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, that's a great point with TJ, and I think MMA has changed quite a bit. I saw your Instagram post; it's been 10 years since you fought in the UFC, and now people really dissect everything that fighters say. Do you miss fighting? Are you thinking about getting in? I know you get that question a lot, but are you happy with being one of the top trainers in the country, or do you still have that itch?
Yeah, I said it in that post too. I'll never say never because I don't know. I mean, I'm only 30 years of age, and I feel like I'm getting much, much better as I train these guys, the likes of, Mike the Savage Kimball, my guy Jack Stapleton, David Espino. You know, as we have these guys coming up, and we have influx of guys cross training us from other gyms around the area, and I feel like as I'm coaching and as I'm training, and I like to have a very hands-on approach when it comes to training my guys. I like to be on the mats. I like to be kind of suffering with them, let them see that the coach isn't just standing there yelling orders. I'm on the mat with them. I'm leading the way. I'm trying to lead by example and build a good sense of camaraderie amongst me and my fighters, so that when we all walk down to the ring, they feel like they've got a solid backing behind them. So, but I feel like in light of all this training that I'm doing, yeah, I feel like I'm becoming a much better martial artist. And over these 10 years, between competing for some of it and then coaching for the remainder of it, I'll never say never, because like I said, I do feel myself getting better as a martial artist. But having said that too, that's why I'll never say never, because right now I am particularly content helping others reach their potential, and then I'm still involved in the game. I'm still able to get a lot of credit as a martial artist with the results that I can produce with my fighters, the guys that I help train, the guys that I help prepare. I still command a lot of respect, even more so probably as a coach than I would as a fighter and as a competitor, because when you're fighting, you're competing, you're constantly in a battle with yourself. You're constantly, you hold yourself under a microscope all the time. It's almost like you're not good enough for yourself when you're competing. And then it takes a special amount of confidence and preparation, having the right people around you to really get the best results. But even at that, you have guys. I mean, if you walked up to Conor McGregor right now, after everything that he's accomplished, and you said, "Hey man, you never fought Tony Ferguson and you lost to Khabib," he'd probably go home that night and think about that all day. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like fighters, they hold themselves to such a high standard. And I feel like I've been able to, making the transition into being a coach, I've been able to come to and understand what I'm great at and what I've been bad at, and understand and take the good the good things that I've accomplished, and also the things that maybe the obstacles that stop me from accomplishing things, and I can take these things and then relay them to my students and the guys that I train with to help them better themselves. And oftentimes I value more the downs versus the ups in grooming these fighters, because it grooms me as a person. I become more accepting of myself, versus when I was a fighter, you hold yourself at a very high regard, and it's hard to accept certain things. You're constantly saying, "No, I'm the best. I got to keep this mindset." But the more humble and more accepting you are of things around you, and you are as an individual, I believe it makes you a lot better. But I can pass these things on to my students and let them know that, look, I've been there. Not only have I been there and I've accomplished things, but I've been there, I've done this, and I've failed. You can't do it the way I did it. We got to look at what I did, and this is how I did it, and it failed. And I can tell you right now that doesn't work. So let's go forward. You know what I mean? So,
Sure. Yeah,
but
definitely.
I'll never say never when it comes to competing.
Well, you really blazed the trail for Irish fighters in the UFC, and when you started training, um, there wasn't really the infrastructure that there is now. How did you get into MMA? Because in Ireland, you're from Ireland, right? That MMA wasn't big when you 10 years ago, or even a little bit before that when you started training. What led you into that?
Well, I feel like, you know, if you're a martial artist, whatever it is that you do, I think ultimately you tend to look at something like mixed martial arts. It depends. It depends on who you are. Like if you're a boxer and you want to pursue boxing, great. If you're a judo player, you want to pursue Olympic judo, fantastic. But I feel like at some part of a martial artist career, they oftentimes look at mixed martial arts and say, what could I do in there? And certainly, I came up through the realm of sport karate, and it's a point scoring combat style competition. So you're basically on the mark of the. It's kind of like fencing. You reset, and then the referee calls go, and it's like first to get a point or 2 points, whatever the whatever the scoring system is, whether it be kick to the head, to the body, punch to the head, punch to the body, different scoring, obviously. But I came up through that, so that kind of taught me balance, speed, coordination, and then of course, I was always a fan of boxing. So as I got later into my teenage years, around 16, 17, I started to watch a little bit more boxing, and also too I paid attention to this UFC thing that I had seen starting to pop up here and there. And I remember saying to myself, I wonder what it would take to get in there. And around 16, 17, I found guys who were doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in my hometown in Newbridge there. So I decided to meet with those guys, train with them, and I started to build a little bit of an appetite because I was like, wow, I'm doing the stuff that I'm watching these UFC guys do. But yeah, you're right. No one had really heard of the UFC or mixed martial arts really at the time. But I was slowly but surely, steadily getting myself prepared mentally to maybe want to compete and do this, just to say, let me just see what I'd be capable of if I were to do something so extreme. Because the way I looked at it was, I did sport karate, doing jiu-jitsu, been doing a little bit of boxing. What would happen if I put all this together? And I also wanted to prove something to myself. I could be like, no one could ever take it away from me, that if I were to fight in an MMA fight and win, I'd be like, you know what, I actually did that, and I could take that with me no matter where I went. So I initially only ever got into competing in mixed martial arts just to see what I could do or where I could go with it. I didn't necessarily have like grand, plans. I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, that I could get in, compete, and win a few fights. And it just so happened that a snowball effect happened. The UFC happened, and then later on down the line, you had Conor McGregor coming up and doing what he did, and then a bunch of other Irish MMA guys getting in there and doing it. Particularly, I remember when I had left to come to Boston and I moved over here. I remember, when I had left the country, I was kind of like that main guy, and it kind of created like a vacuum. And that's when, you had a bunch of these guys wanting to rally to get back and get going, get competing. And they did phenomenal. Guys like Carl Pendred, Paddy Houlihan, Owen Roddy. And then, of course, you had McGregor. Well, Owen Roddy had already been, he had already been a staple MMA fighter in Ireland. But I'm saying you had like Carl Pendred, Paddy Houlihan, Aisling Daly, all these people. And, of course, Conor McGregor were able to get in and, get that number one spot going. I think at that point, there had been a case of trial and error with me, and I think by the time I had left and come over to the United States, because I wanted to change the scenery, I wanted to get out and do my own thing. I think that left, people were able to take, okay, well, what we did maybe didn't work. Let's see what else we can do, and they started to find success with like I said, with that trial and error thing.
Yeah, definitely, man. You a trailblazer, definitely. I think it's part of that pioneer spirit. That idea of trying something that most people don't want to do, and then coming to America as well. What brought you to the States, and what do you see as a big difference between how individual freedom is viewed here in the States versus it is in Ireland?
Well, certainly what brought me here initially was just, I love myself and my family were blessed that we had friends that, had owned like a house in Florida, and we were able to vacation there every other year. We'd save up, every 2 years and go and vacation down in Florida. And I know Florida, if you live in the United States, you realize Florida is kind of its own world. It's a different planet down there. Right? It's like, it's a bunch of northeast Americans living down in the south. It's a bizarre scene down there, but I always loved going there. And whenever I would be here, like early teens, even before that, 11, 12 years old, we would be over here. I'd always be watching the TV, and I just loved the way of life over here. A nice pace, everything was kind of cool. It was new, modern, a lot less old fashioned. You know, it was just the way of life was really cool. You know, I used to love all. I remember I was the first person amongst my friends to be wearing high top sneakers in Ireland, and I used to get shit for it all the time. They'd be like, "What do you think, Aaron? You think? Look at you there with because I'd wear a tank top. I literally remember wearing one time I wore like a tank top, basketball shorts, and high tops one day, and my friends crucified me. They were like, "Oh, you're trying to be American. You're trying to be American." I'm like, "What are you talking about, bro? I just want to wear this. Like, get off my ass." You know what I mean? So.
That's funny.
Ireland, obviously, Ireland, even still to this day, well, kind of still has like somewhat of an old-fashioned sense to it, conservative sense to it, where it's like, you know, it's not cool to try new things or be different. You can't be yourself, be an individual. You kind of have to fall in line with everybody else, or you suck. And sometimes you can get on the bad side of things. You know, I've been there before where I wore a baseball hat backwards, and you know, guys wanted to start a fight with me just because, you know.
That's
Yeah,
nuts.
yeah, like that. Yeah, you know, very old fashioned, and that obviously comes with, you know, you can trail that back to years and years of like, you know, just people being too old fashioned and obviously being put down by the church and the state and stuff like that, and you know, people losing a sense of identity. And Ireland has definitely had a case of identity issues over the last few decades since we gained our independence. You know, it's like post independent war era Ireland is, you know, we definitely were sold out by a lot of different.
With the Irish Civil War and the breakup there of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
nationalists, the
obviously
Republicans.
obviously a very complicated, delicate history. There, you know, very obvious to some, not so obvious to others what happened and how it went down. But certainly, you know, it's certainly a fact that we definitely got sold out to the church. The church got to take over, you know, have their way with the rule of the land, and you know, and then of course being sold out by politicians who didn't really put the Irish people first. They wanted to make themselves look better in the eyes of Europe and even in the eyes of Britain, who we had separated from. You know, tried to get our independence and fought so hard for. So, like I said, Ireland's definitely, you know, but we're getting much better. I mean, definitely with the rise of McGregor, he had a huge influence on the culture, and him being a trailblazer himself and being an individual, you know, certainly has changed somewhat of the culture. You definitely have guys wearing the hats backwards, high tops, tank top. Like no one cares as much now anymore since Conor McGregor came out, and I will give him that credit. That was one really cool thing that I thought was great. that whole I'm gonna do what I want to do type of mentality, you know. But of course, they still get you. It's still not quite there. The politics in Ireland is definitely not great. I'm not a big fan of it. That's one of the one of the reasons why I love the United States is the fact that you are here in a country where, even though it's still a battle nowadays, you are here in a place where you can have your individual freedoms, your individual rights. You know, some states are better than others.
Mm-hmm.
Some states are even more. You know, some states in the United States, you know, have that they're maybe a little bit more individual freedoms, but then they still have more of the old-fashioned sense to them. And then, of course, you got some states that have both. They're modern and they believe in you know, individual rights and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely believe that the separation of church and state is huge when it comes to individual rights and freedoms for us to move forward and keep going. You know,
I think we take that for granted here, and the freedom of speech, and the right to bear arms, and the right to privacy, and all of these things that I think most Americans don't even know what the Bill of Rights are, let alone appreciate how much of a revolutionary document that was written all those years ago.
Yeah, it's you know, when I was just in Philadelphia recently for Thanksgiving, actually I have a picture of Philadelphia here.
I like it.
Actually right next to the American flag right there. But
and Thanos' glove, of course, the Infinity Gauntlet, right?
But actually right behind that flag, I have the Constitution and the amendments. They're all rolled up. I haven't taken them out, but no, it's huge. Like, of course, when I went to Pennsylvania, I learned about that by the time that was written and put together and signed, it was the first time in history any of that stuff had been put together, and really is like, you know, a historic document and what those men did and how they did it, and it's crazy that people always say, "Oh, the Constitution is written in 1776," and it's 2018. Well, it's like, well, look what's going on in China right now. Look what's going on in Europe. You got France are in an absolute crisis. Europe's in a crisis right now, and then you got China. They're rounding up Muslims, making them drink beer, and watch porn and stuff like that. It's like literally, back to Nazi Germany stuff going on right now. You know what I mean? So
Re-education camps, yeah, definitely.
like re-education camp. They're
Right.
concentration camps, essentially. You know what I
They
mean?
are,
So it's
right.
and then that's where the U.S. Constitution stands strong, and these men who wrote it and who stood for it and who fought for it are absolute revolutionaries. Touching on what we're talking about, I saw a thing there. The thing that's going viral right now about the kids who kind of held their ground. They were wearing the MAGA hats, and they had the Native American coming up to them beating the drum.
Right.
And of course, you had the whole lefty narrative off of that video was, oh, you're on stolen land and all this kind of stuff. Well, I said, what land isn't stolen or hasn't been stolen? Like, if you go to Europe, France, Italy, Germany, Ireland, England, those lands are stolen 10 times over. You know what I mean? 10 times over. The original people don't even live in those lands anymore, or wherever they are. Or you look at Egypt. Egypt is all Arab now. It's not even African anymore.
Right.
Northern Africa is all Arab, essentially. It's not even African. China has been stolen a million times over. Mongolia has been stolen a million times over. Russia has been stolen a million times over. And unfortunately, it's a way of nature that, the strongest survive. But here's one thing that, I hate when people say about the United States that it's stolen land. Like I said, I use that argument as if to say, what land hasn't been stolen? And sometimes throughout time, there's wars and people conquer, but what's the result of it? And certainly the result of the United States is a greater place. It's a better land, better rules, better laws for people to survive and thrive on. Like, even when the United States was being built, you were to go over to Britain or Europe, the government could just take your house and take your land for their own gain, and there's nothing you could do about it. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Versus here, when they were building the United States, and the reason why our borders, the states have those squiggly lines in the east, is because those lands had to be bought off of people who had already been settled there, and they had to give them a choice what state they wanted to be in, what they believed in. There was vote systems, and the government had to buy certain land, or the state had to buy the land. That's why it's all carved out. The reason why it's all straight lines when you go out to the west, because nobody owned that land. So Congress was able to carve out the western part of the United States, versus in the east, it was all bought. It's not like in Europe where they could just go and take, and you'd have no protection. There was no Bill of Rights or constitutional rights. And also too, the other thing is too, show me another country where post wars with the native or indigenous people where you know so much about that indigenous people. I mean, I've friends who have Native American in them, and their kids and their grandkids will get free education. They will get benefits. They'll get all these things because of their blood. And certainly, I know more about, and I'm sure the world knows a lot more about Native Americans than they do about the natives in Brazil or the natives in Mexico, or the native. Those people maybe don't get those same benefits and rights that certainly this country does give back. So, okay, maybe there was a war and there was a winner, and the people that moved here built the United States, but they also built a phenomenal country, a foundation of laws and rules that are better than anywhere else. Certainly when it comes to, catering to the individual and the individual rights. But at the exact same time, it's like the people that were here and that fought those wars are certainly remembered. They're remembered. They're also, commemorated. They're also, people who you go to Washington, D.C., there's Native American museums that you can go into, and they're beautiful and they're amazing. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
That's a good point about groups that when something is taken over by another group, is normally those people are wiped off the face of the earth, and it's a terrible thing, and it's a complicated issue. But I think what happens is that people want to throw away the Bill of Rights or the Constitution or the ideas of individualism because they feel like it's connected to the Native Americans being kicked off their land and that sort of thing. When the principles are eternal, I believe that that every individual does have inherent natural rights, and that I think I think you're right about the debate, that it's not about what has happened before, but really about where we're going in the future, right? What was the
Right.
result of what happened and where we're at? And you talked about with the Gaelic language. You talked about shouting out in Ireland in your native tongue, and it seems like there's a push to really bring that back. Is that something that a lot of Irish folks are into, or is that just a small group that's trying to bring that part of history back?
Yeah, well, that's the problem. Is the thing in Ireland is that our culture, was suppressed for a long time, and then of course when we did gain our independence back, it wasn't, revisited, or wasn't rejuvenated, or wasn't revived correctly in the way it should have been. I mean, like I said, it's a complicated, multi-layered history that we have with our independence, and where Ireland, basically, we were at a crossroads, and with the death of Michael Collins, who was basically the leader of the independent, the leader of our independence, and the guy who basically pushed the war. He was the mastermind behind our, us gaining attention and gaining our independence. When he had died, and he was assassinated by Irishmen, basically, who, like I said, complicated, multi-layered issue, where he was used as a political scapegoat by another politician named Eamon de Valera, who was looking to be uppity and like fancy on the world stage, trying to do things right, but it wasn't right for the Irish people. You see this a lot, right? You see it nowadays. Politicians want to look good amongst each other versus like, what's good for your people? What did you do for your people? And certainly when he was assassinated, a lot of what Ireland could have been went out the window with it. One of them being, restoring Ireland's culture, including the language, including a lot of things that really made us. I mean, if you go back in history, the Celts, who Irish people are descendants of, they began in the far east, in the Middle East. And we know this because of the ancient Greek. They documented them and counted them in eastern Turkey. They called them Keltoi. And then later on in history, we had the Romans, who had battled them numerous times. In fact, there's been times where Celtic tribes have had many pivotal wins in battle over the Romans, were set foot in the Roman capital, and then fought the Romans over and over again throughout Europe. But those men, they all spoke Gaelic. They had a very strong culture. They're a very amazing culture, and they eventually made their way all the way across to Ireland. But a lot of that history isn't really, noticed by a lot of people. And certainly, that part of history could have been revisited and revived a lot more. When we did gain our independence, and particularly the language, which is, such an old language. Like I said, it comes from thousands of years of guys who came from the Middle East, made their way all across Europe, fought the Romans, fought the Vikings, fought everybody. Won. These strong, amazing culture, amazing men and women. They put women on the forefront of their culture. We have many strong, powerful queens. And then of course, when Ireland, gained its independence, and unfortunately, when the likes of Michael Collins, when he had been assassinated, we didn't really have any of that good, solid leadership to put the culture back on track. We kind of lost a lot of it, and still to this day, I can't even name an authentic Irish dish that isn't British influenced.
Wow.
I can't name an Irish dish that would be what you would consider Irish, like Celtic Irish. I can only tell you an Irish dish that is British influenced. We don't have, and our language is one of the last things that we have that is authentically Irish Celtic. I can't really name anything. We have music, we have our language, but certainly, like, it would have been nice if we could have had the whole culture revisited, kind of like the way they do in Japan. They're modern, but they take a step back into their old fashioned, into their cultural side. When I was in Tokyo, throughout the day you'd have a very conservative, very business-like look to the people,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was during the summer, so they had like certain festivals in the summer where they would go and watch fireworks, and everyone would get dressed in their kimonos and their sandals, and they'd do their hair up, and it was very traditional. That's a beautiful thing. But
to combine the
unfortunately,
old with the new, yeah, definitely. I think
yeah,
there's a lot of value
it's
to
beautiful.
that.
A lot of value to it. And the problem is nowadays you have people who are so far gone that they look at the Irish language as something that's not necessary, and it's like, I don't think when it comes to language and culture, I don't think you need to look at what's necessary. It's like you need to look at what It's one thing being what's necessary, but it's another thing, your identity, who you are, what you're made up of, the people that brought you to the point where you are, and what were the values and things that they held closest to themselves, and certainly language is a big part of it. They say that language is the first factor that defines a culture, and then it's music and food and literature, but certainly it's the language in what is the main force of a culture. So the problem is now you've got a very small percentage of people that speak the language fluently, and I think one of my biggest arguments when it comes to the Gaelic language, or the Celtic language, or the Irish language, if you want to call it, is that if we were to raise our kids on both English and Gaelic, you would have a stronger cultural identity. You now have kids who are more well equipped to learning a third and a fourth language easier, because there's been many studies that prove that when you grow up with more than one language, your ability to take on a third and a fourth and a fifth, and your ability to be multilingual is a lot greater, because your brain has the capability to go back and forth from two different languages. You know what I'm saying?
That makes sense.
So, yeah, give your kids the ability to be able to learn a third and a fourth language easier, and then you still hold on to your cultural identity. You still keep what was basically yours, what is yours, what is basically bred into you. When you're born and bred into a culture, you own that. That's your culture. It's part of you. You can't escape
like
it.
your
It's part of you.
DNA. It's like your
It's in your
genetics.
it is. It's your DNA, exactly. The same as like we talked about what the United States is founded on, your natural God-given rights,
Right.
to defend yourself. I mean, like, I don't believe anybody back in the Stone Age wrote into legislation that a caveman couldn't hold a sword and a spear to defend his own cave and his family and his grounds. I mean, like, that's what he used to hunt. That's what he used to defend himself. That's your God-given right. There should be no governing power to tell you that you can't do that, or you can't certainly speak your mind, say what you want to say without offending people. Like, you don't like it, move on. But I should be able to say what I want to say. I should be able to defend myself. And certainly, I think when it comes to cultural freedom, you should be able to have the ability to raise your kids with that culture that you have, that's given to you by nature, just because of the history of the men and women that have given that to you, essentially. So I really hope that at some point in time we can get to that point in Ireland where people are not so naive to the fact that culture is very important, and it helps you grow as a person. Even intellectually, it gives you, if you're more well equipped with your culture, it gives you a greater ability to be smarter in a way, because you're more well equipped with your own history, with your own language, music, food, culture. If you look at people who are typically very well cultured, they're very intelligent people. Very very open minded, and very educated individuals. So I hope that some point in the future, Ireland can get to that point where. And there's another thing. What I mean by politicians selling Irish people out is that for decades now, the Irish culture was associated with, because obviously naturally in Ireland, when we gained our independence in 1922, well, not fully independent, but we became a free state and got what we wanted, got our own government, and of course we then used the courts and the political system then to go from there, which is again Michael Collins' idea. But from that point on, it's like the rebuilding of the culture certainly lacked, and there wasn't enough emphasis put on these things that certainly would have strengthened the culture. Wait, I was going to make a point there. I'm have to go blank.
That's okay. You did get hit in the head the other day, so nobody holds that against you.
Yeah, but I was talking about how the culture has been suppressed by our politicians, because Of course, you had the struggle of gaining your independence, and then naturally, when Ireland, as part of the deal, we had to give up the six states in the north of Ireland. They basically, part of the deal of becoming a free state is that they would be still part of Great Britain, which a lot of people didn't like, including the people that were forced to make the deal. But again, like I said, it's a multi-layered
Because that
history
had to
there.
do with religion too, right? The Catholics and the Protestants.
Yeah, well, it never really was a religious war. The
Okay.
religion came into it as part of identity. It was like, when they basically tried to identify themselves, who was Irish and who was English, because we looked the same, we spoke English, we basically dressed the same. How did you identify yourself? And if you identified yourself as a Catholic, it doesn't matter what your accent was or where you're from. If you identified yourself as a Catholic, you were Irish, and if you were considered yourself Protestant, you're part of the British Crown, and that made you the enemy, or vice versa. So it was an identity thing, and religion got pulled into it. But certainly, when those 6 states were given up, pockets of resistance of people. Because if you could just imagine for a second living in the northeast of the United States, right? Take New England for example. Imagine if somehow there was a war between the United States and Russia, and Russia, due to certain complications, certain people in the homeland, screwing other people over, putting themselves first, leads to Russia somewhat getting the upper hand in a peace deal. And in the deal, we have to give up New England in order to be able to keep the United States. And then the people who live in New England don't consider themselves Russian; they consider themselves American citizens. That's basically that's as basic as I can get it, to think of what it's like in this. You have people who've been living there for generations, consider themselves Irish, now living in a state where they now have to change the currency. They have to use the same currency as the Great Britain. They have money that has the Queen's head on it. They have the basically, you're loyal. You have to be loyal to the crown. All this kind of stuff. You got to go to war when they want you to go to war. So that's basically what it's like. You're living on your land, who's now being governed by somebody else. So that's kind of what it was like. So naturally, over the course of the 20th century, pockets of resistance popped up, and most famous is the IRA. And the IRA, they prided themselves on the language, the culture, everything like that. So the Free State, or the Republic of Ireland, as we called it, those politicians, again, being selfish, being uppity, trying to be better in the eyes of the world or the politician, rather than saying, we denounce the terrorism that they're causing up there, we should do it politically. But what they did was they actually denounced, and they basically basically, if you were being patriotic, or you were, when I mean patriotic, I mean the language, the history, the everything that came with being an independent Irish citizen, they related that to terrorism, and they were linking that with terrorism. So now, if the language, the culture, the music, all that stuff was suppressed even more so by the politicians at the time. And they, of course, like they typically do, and we see it nowadays, they use fancy words, and they use clean-cut looks to try and basically push the agenda across, and then they further suppress freedom, culture, rights, all this kind of stuff. So now, of course, then you had like the 60s, 70s, 80s, where the language was really, really pushed down. People weren't being raised with it. People weren't really talking about it. People in the west of Ireland who spoke it literally from birth, like, because there's people in the west of Ireland, like pockets of areas of cities and towns that like speak it daily, day in, day out, like at home. They're reared with it. They raised with the language, like everything. I've got friends who didn't speak English till they were 15. And they're in their 60s now. They're in their 50s, 60s now. But that doesn't really exist anymore. But I'm saying during those times, those people they suffered, what's the word I'm looking for? There was certainly
discrimination or oppression.
Discrimination. There was huge discrimination against people. Like, they were looked at as poor, as like
Ignorant.
the lower class people. Farmers. They were looked down upon by people who were living in the east of Ireland, who were all like English speaking. Where the schools were at. But like I said, they suppressed those people, and I think, like I said, going with the history, I was getting into, alluding to the fact that the culture has been very suppressed, and sold out by politicians in Ireland, again, trying to make themselves greater in everyone else's eyes instead of saying, what's good for our people here. You can easily denounce terrorism without saying that being patriotic is being part of it. You know what I'm saying?
Ideas. Yeah, they want to equate ideas that threaten the bureaucracy and the aristocracy and the people who are in power. They want to get rid of those ideas and attach it to, if God forbid somebody does do something terrible and, like a terrorist act. But they try to sweep away the idea that everybody has inherent natural rights, and they want to be the ones who dole those rights out. It seems like country after country, that's the narrative that people live under.
Yeah, people always want to control. I mean, I just put a thing on my Instagram there the other day. I listed a bunch of things that basically was Adolf Hitler. And
I saw that. I took a screenshot of that. I've saved that.
Yeah, I mean, because it's true. And the list sounds quite familiar. I mean, he was a vegetarian and animal lover. Oh, that's nice. And then it's like he's a socialist, right? He believed in socialist, big government, right, censorship and control of the media by way of newspapers and radio, and then of course used constant racial narratives to get elected. I mean, that sounds very similar to what's going on nowadays over here. And for people not to see how history repeats itself, so it's like, all right, nowadays it's like, they're this and you can't say that, you can't be mean, and then it's like, you can't say this, you can't say that, and then it's like, what are you doing? We're in your pocket. Your life is ours, and next thing you know, boom, you're right back into a totalitarian state. You're right back under a dictatorship. It starts off nice and sweet,
right?
And then next thing you know, they get you. So that's what people don't see it coming, and it sounds great. I mean, communism and socialism on paper, yeah, it sounds great. Everyone gets equally shared it, but that's not how humans work. Humans get selfish, and they want to tell each other what to do, and there's always a flaw.
People want to do the least. They want to do the least amount of work for the most result, and if they can use the force of government to do that, they're going to do that in as much as they can get away with.
Right, and the funny thing is, like the people also don't realize, and I didn't have enough space to put on the friggin' picture there, but Hitler used the welfare, and he used welfare, number one, obviously, to keep people on the government's dime, which is obviously what communists do as well. But he also used the big taxes and big government to fund the likes of the SS and the Gestapo that could then go around and start really putting the hammer down on people. And he did it so well that people were just falling for it, and people were just submissive to it, and they went about their daily lives not realizing that this monstrous machine was being built.
That's a good way to put it. Monstrous machine. That's exactly what they were building.
A monstrous, destructive machine was being built underneath their eyes, and they had no idea. You know what I mean?
Too, that people forget that propaganda and eugenics, the Germans learned that from the people in the United States, like Edward Bernays. He was the head of basically the war propaganda during World War I. And they learned all those techniques from the people in the United States that were pushing big government, that pushed us into World War I. And then the eugenics on top of that was in all the big universities that they were studying how to improve the race through selective breeding, basically. And the Germans, they ran with that. So I think it's, the talk about science all the time, that you're accused of being anti-science, but I think people are very leery about science being used in public policy to take away freedoms and to control people. And I think there's a huge narrative that going on right now as well.
Yeah, it's all control. It's all control. They use scare tactics, like global warming is a big one there, for example. I mean, did we cause the ice age? Did we cause all the extreme heat waves that happened all during the prehistoric times? Did we cause the deoxidation of the earth, which ultimately led to certain dinosaurs dying? And then, of course, once they died, then the predators that preyed on them died, and so on and so forth. I mean, where is this giant meteor crater? I don't know where it is. It's nowhere. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just a gradual time of the earth changing, and naturally, when the climates change naturally over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, animals die, the predators that preyed on them die, the certain plants don't. So it starts off with certain plants don't grow. Then certain animals die. Then the animals that preyed on them die also, and then you lose animals and species and everything over a course of thousands. Like, no one can always survive. The only ones that can survive more than any other animal on this planet is us, because we can adapt so well. We're so smart that we don't have fur, we'll kill you and take your fur. We don't have fangs, we'll take this rocks, sharpen it up, make it into 25,000 fangs in the forms of arrows and spears and swords. So what I'm saying is, like, now they use scare tactics. They want to say, oh, well, we're causing this, we're causing that. Now we got to implement tax. We got to do this. We got to get in your pocket. We got to scare you, make you feel like, you're inadequate. You have to submit to us in order to save the world. And it's just a way to further control you. You know what I mean?
It's like the overpopulation. They talk about that the world is going to collapse because there's way too many people. And my take is that babies are never the problem. When people start saying that kids are the problem, I think society is in big trouble.
So elaborate on that. What do you mean? Elaborate on that. I'm interested in what you're saying there.
Sure. Well, I've been reading some sci-fi lately, some old stuff. Robert Heinlein, I don't know if you've ever read any of his stuff, but he wrote like Starship Troopers, Moon is a Harsh Mistress. But he talked about that in a society that your treasures are your children and women who are in their childbearing years, because a lot of men can die off, and as long as you have the women and the children, that society will live on. But it seems like the narrative of overpopulation is talking about that kids are the problem, but it's not their kids specifically; it's other people's kids, and I think that's a real dangerous issue that can lead down to what we're talking about, like monstrous machines being built. First, they have to sell the narrative that there's too many people, and then they sell the narrative that there's too many of the wrong people. And I think we're getting to that point where they're starting to get to that point of, like you talked about the environment, they're using that to control people and to push us into these systems where they want to control just about every resource on the planet, and they'll use whatever they can to do that. And so the idea that children are the problem, they don't come out and say it that way. They say overpopulation, but what they really mean is other people's children are the problem. And but I think too that you talked about with Ireland, about the culture, but I've never seen another country come out so hard for their own, like at different places, like at fights and that sort of thing. When you had your fight, it was insane with the turnout. It seems like there's a strong identity, but it seems like
it's not 100% ours though. You know what I mean? Like the identity, the Irish people. The beautiful thing with the Irish people, and that I love, is that you're right, with an identity that is essentially, not really 100% ours, we still rally together on it. And imagine how much stronger our culture and our ability to, you take our ability, like you said, to go out and support in massive waves. Like McGregor used to say, one of us goes to war, we all go to war, right? And it is true with the Irish people. We ride to the death when it comes to that stuff. But imagine now if we had a culture where, you were well equipped with the language, with the history behind what gave you that language, the people that fought all across Europe, eventually made their way to Ireland, the people that while in Ireland fought the Vikings, the Normans, and beat them out of there. Like, imagine if you were equipped with all that cultural strength, how much stronger our culture would be. And maybe we'd be more likely to have, better educated people running our country right now. I mean, like, I talk to people in my country right now, and they're just like, especially people who own businesses, and I'm like, they're plateauing because they can't go any further because the government is like taxing them more and more and more, and it's just to fund the social welfare every year. But yet somehow the politicians manage to get raises every year.
Always.
I mean, our politicians annually make more money than the president of the United States. How does that work? Wow. So,
and then you have the EU on top of that too, right? You have
yes, we got all these taxes now. The government's implementing all these taxes, right? And then business owners are just getting really hit hard. You're better off in Ireland right now just living on the social welfare. And what happens then? You become content. You live on the government's dime. And then they own you, They own you, essentially.
It's almost like they're domesticating humans. That's what it seems like these programs are to do. is
It's
to
insane.
take us from wolves to dogs.
And it's insane. And then all these politicians in Ireland are just like, oh, as long as we look okay, as long as we're, and then they look after everybody else but themselves. That's why I think it's important that we have someone like Donald Trump in power and president as the president of the United States, because he's showing, whether you love him, whether you hate him, he's showing that, you're elected to serve a country, and that's the country that you should serve. And you should look after that country's best interests. If you were to break it down from president all the way down to like just living in your own household, um, if I'm the dad and I have a wife and 3, 4 kids, right, and maybe my brother and a cousin living in the house, yet I spend more time managing my neighbors' gardens and keeping their and cleaning their houses, yet every time I come home, my place is falling apart little by little by little. You got to look after your own first, and
That's a
then you
great
can look after.
analogy.
Like if I'm living in my own home and I don't look after my house, but I'm looking after my neighbors and I'm looking after that, my place is going to fall apart, and that's what happens. But yet, but guess what? All the neighbors love me because old Tom comes around and cleans up. Oh my God, he's great. Yeah, wow, what a great guy. But really, they haven't been in my house. My house is falling apart. My family hates me. You know, um, or I found a way to convince them that what I'm doing is right. I'm just saying, like, when you break it down into the smallest, that's what it's like. And the problem in Ireland right now is you got people over there that are worried about everybody else and not about their own. And I think that's the big thing about Trump right now, is that he's showing that you need to worry about your own, and you will see great strides, which we are. I mean, they can't argue with the results that he's had in his first 2 years in office. It's incredible.
And I think too that when people talk about individual freedom, there's that personal responsibility aspect of it as well. Is that it goes hand in hand, like you talked about, taking care of yourself first and your family first, and then what was the old quote? Charity, starts at home. And people don't even really talk about those ideas anymore. I don't know if you're familiar with Jordan Peterson at all. Have you heard him talk? He's been on Rogan and some other stuff. He wrote 12 Rules for Life, and his big thing is to square yourself away first. Make your bed first. He even starts it at that basic level. And I think that applies to everything in life, is that you take care of what you can now instead of going out trying to tell everybody else how to live. But that seems to be a way for politicians to make a lot of money.
Well, that's it. I mean, I just saw there about presidents and politicians in the United States what their net worth was going into office and what the net worth was coming out. And of the likes of Clinton, Obama, and Bush, and all these other guys, their net worth was a lot lower than what it was when they left office, right? Because they're obviously taking money from lobbyists and corporations to pass laws and legislation that they want. Now you have a guy who went into office a multi-billionaire, right? Which is great because now he can't get bought out, right? He can actually say, I don't need to make money. This is the one thing where I can actually just pursue and make sure I do a good job at. And then you look at his net worth, I think he's like down $1 billion since he's actually entered into office. So he obviously used his own money in a lot of ways to, in his campaign to become president, and of course other things while he is president.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of people say that to get money out of politics, but the only way to do that is to either spend your own, and another way is to shrink the size of government so everybody's not competing to get a hold of the $4 trillion budget. Because people forget that every dollar spent by the federal government or state government comes out of the pocket of somebody else, and it goes into the pocket of somebody else too. So I think shrinking federal government is definitely something that would be a good thing for everybody. Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. And like, the funny thing is, I know a lot of people out there, and they're very anti-authority. They're like, almost have this like anarchist style like mentality on things, but yet they vote for the left. And it's like, do you not realize you're voting for the bigger government, the more control? You're voting like you're anti-authority, yet you're voting for the side that's going to put bit more authority on you. It blows my mind when people mistakenly do that, just because one side is riding off of society's little things, tugging on the heartstrings here and there when it comes to certain topics, um, and it takes bipartisan, uh, you know, uh, bipartisan work to get all these laws and regulations put into place.
Right.
So, but they get one side tugging on the heartstrings of people, and then sliding in these little, little things here and there, and people just jump on it, not realizing that is exactly what they're doing. It's a mousetrap. They put the bit of cheese there, wait for you to jump on it, and then they catch it.
That's right. And I was looking at something that said 100 years ago, you didn't have to have a license to farm. You didn't have to have a license to drive. You didn't have a license to own a gun. And it just went through all of these things that you never needed a license for. And today it's like you need a license to even put a garden in your backyard in some places. It's definitely insane.
I mean, when it comes down to that stuff, like I'm obviously pro-gun. I'm pro-choice too, because even though the whole abortion thing is touchy, but I still think it'd be un-American for us to dictate and say that you can't do what you have to do this with your body. And people may disagree with me on it, but
that's a tough one. Yeah,
it's a tough one. But again, separation of church and state. You got to look what one person does is not going to affect me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't have to go to bed with that person's. Whatever they go through when it comes to that abortion. And some women out there, abortion is necessary, and then some women out there, abortion is not necessary to get it anyways because maybe they screwed up and it's a sad thing. But guess what? That's them. That's their problems. It's like I shouldn't have to put a finger down that. Like I think it's very important. I think for people, especially in this country, in the United States, to realize that when it comes down to something like abortion, which is one thing, but I think it's so great. The topic's so great and so heavy and so large and so complex that I think it does set the tone for a lot of other things, right? So, when you want freedom, you have to give freedom. And I think that, if I should be able to own a gun, I should be able to have the choice whether I want to get an abortion or not. I should be able to marry whoever the hell I want to marry, and I should be able to do whatever I want to do. And again, separating church and state in that regard. And I think that ultimately will lead us down a healthy road versus if we're wanting to give certain freedoms but take away others. Like we had the one incident in Ireland there a couple of years ago where, where we just voted nationally to change the constitution to allow abortion in Ireland because we had an incident where there was an Indian woman. She was giving birth. She was supposed to give birth. Complications happened. And the doctor said that they couldn't save the baby, but that the woman was going to die too. So the husband said, if the baby's not going to survive, please just save my wife. Abort the baby and save my wife. And the doctors were like, we can't do that. So the baby and the mother died because of that law, and that's very unfortunate. So that's obviously where complex things come in when it comes to something like abortion. But again, it comes down to freedom, and I do think a lot of people use the narrative that if you allow abortion, it's just going to happen all the time. I don't necessarily believe that, because that's like saying, well, if you allow guns, there'll be shootings all the time. It's not the case, right? I think it's there for people to be able to be like, okay, shit, if something happens, and like in the case of rape, for example, or in the case of just young kids and they've got a whole life ahead of them, and they happen to get together and they don't practice safe sex, and now they're faced with bringing a child is the word that is, what's more cruel, bringing a child into a world with a very poor setup that would probably cause it a lifetime of issues down the road, versus, like, I know it's hard to say, but versus the abortion. It's like there's so many complicated things, like you got all these funky things that can happen to that child down the road when it's not born into a good environment, or you can have a safe environment where a woman could go to have the baby aborted. Now, I'm not particularly fond of the idea of aborting a baby. What I'm saying is that if you go down to Brazil, for example, you've had women down there because of anti-abortion laws where they've gone to these clinics out of desperation because they've gotten raped or this, that, and the other.
That's the problem with that, definitely.
It's awful. It's like drugs, If you were to legalize heroin and you could go to CVS to buy the right equipment to be able to
totally agree. It. Yes,
you'd probably have a safer and a much lower risk of things
People
because,
wouldn't be dying from fentanyl overdoses if you could buy legal heroin, because 30 to 40,000 people are dying because their heroin is spiked with fentanyl, and so
of
they don't know
course.
the dosage, and so you could save 30 to 40,000 people overnight if
Of
that was
course.
really the goal of those in power.
Yeah, of course. And I often say some stuff like this, and I have people retaliate with like, "Oh, well, I had family members that I lost to heroin, I lost to drugs," my response is always like, "Yeah, under this current system, under them getting it a certain way all the time, and then not to mention it has other shit in it that's obviously screwing with them as well." Anyways, but to finish off on that, I do believe that if we go forward, we need to, freedoms across the board. Obviously, we need laws and things in place, but I think when it comes down to individual freedoms and rights, I do believe that the country we live in now is the best at it. It's the best that does it, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come here, and the reason why I like to stay here is because I have those freedoms and rights. Excuse me, and because there's people here who feel so strongly about it. I feel like when you go to Europe, Europe has had a history of just sitting back and just letting the government walk all over you. You see it in Ireland, we've seen it in Germany, we've seen it all across Europe, Russia. It happens all the time. The government just walks over the people. Here, it does not happen like that. And that's one thing that I like about it here. People fight back. And if there is a rule or there's a law, it's in place for a reason. You go to Europe and so many times you see rules and laws. Why is this here? Oh, well, because don't worry about that. No, I am worried about it. Why is that there? It's like, and it usually has some old-fashioned religious thing to do with it that they kept in place again for the sake of control and keeping laws and legislation on people. But yeah, man, this has been a good talk.
More freedom, the better. That's what we're about here at Chronically Human,
Exactly.
man. I think that you said it well. That I think that the more freedom you have, the more responsibility you also have to have. But at the same time, that improves your ability to adapt and to grow and to learn in the world. The more you have to rely on yourself, and the more you have to seek voluntary cooperation from other people instead of using the force of government, that strengthens society and doesn't weaken it.
Right, and people don't have self accountability anymore. When do people not just hold themselves accountable, or countries, or states, or cultures, religions? No one's holding themselves accountable for things. One of my students recently, I had him matched up for a fight, and I kind of had to pull him out of it because his life was starting to fall apart the second I got him. He blamed everything on everything else for everything that was happening. And I said to him, "Look, man," I was like, I hate to say it, but you're the only person that has the power to change what goes on the second you step out that door. Like you, it all starts with you. Every decision you make, how you feel about it, how you perceive it, everything that happens, your mood, it all starts with you. You'll get jammed up if you allow yourself to get jammed up, and if you get yourself all caught up in funky things, so you have the ability to change things. And I said it to him quite simply, like if you're about to fight, you need to be 100% there, and if you're letting everything else fall apart in your life, you gotta reevaluate that and say, hold on a second, you gotta be self accountable. It's not the guy's fault that he hit your car. It's not. You're probably driving around recklessly thinking about the fight, and you're cutting a corner too fast. You know what I'm saying? Like, self accountability is huge, and I don't think there's enough of it nowadays. And I think the more we have, the more we can all be self accountable for things, and be able to sit back and say, what do I have? What do I have within my power to change?
That's a
What
great.
can I do?
That's exactly right, Tom. What can I change? Today we have people. Seems like there's an outrage industry out there that people yelling about what everybody else is doing, but people don't turn that same spotlight on themselves. And I think that's a great one to end on there, Tom. Is personal accountability. That we have the freedom, but we also have the accountability in the end. And I think being a fighter like you are, and a trainer, that the mental mindset of a fighter, I think, is something that everybody can benefit from as far as that goes. And just one quick question: when you are training for a fight, what about your mental preparation? What are you doing to get into that mindset to step into the cage? I know we're a little over time here, but I just
Yeah,
wanted to ask you that for myself personally. I thought that was,
yeah, yeah. No, it's a great question. Personally, I've always had. It's always been different for me, right? I mean, I've had certain things that have motivated me for certain fights, and have other things that have motivated me for other fights. And then I've had fights where I wasn't really motivated. I was competing for the sake of competing, and that's one of the things that I certainly always tell my students not to do. I always tell them, look, when you're going in here, you got to go in here 1,000%. It's not fun and games. It's not fun. We're not going in here to have fun and to have a good time and to put on a performance. I'm like, you're gonna have to kill. It's war. It's death or nothing. You know, you just go out and you have to go straight to the death. You know, you have to be willing to just put yourself out there and go for it, because the second you start playing things down and you know, certain fighters, they go into fights in denial. Oh, I'm just gonna have fun, or you know, don't listen to the crowd. No, listen to the crowd. Listen to the noise. Take in all those vibes, all that, you know, all the stress. If you deny that, it puts more stress on you. Accept it all. You know, take in, you know, all those feelings where you're getting nervous and the butterflies. That's your knockout punch. That's your sprawl. That's your takedown. That's your ability to finish a fight. That's your survival kicking in right there. So use that. So that's what I use for my fighters. I get them prep mentally for, it's not a game, and we're going all out. And once you do that, you allow that primitive survival nature to kick in, and once that happens, it's pretty significant, the power of survival and the fight or flight. You know, that when you hear that cage door lock, you realize the only way out of here is either I beat him or he beats me. And it sounds like a stressful thought, but when you the fights that I've had, that's been my approach. I've completely dominated the fight. But fights where I've gone in and tried to deny what's going on, what really is happening, you know, they've been, you know, not been my best performances. So I try and instill that into my fighters. I try and tell them, look, you're going in there and it's to the death.
Wow, that's awesome, Tom. I appreciate that perspective. I don't think a lot of people will ever get into the cage and fight. I know I won't, but it's definitely good to hear that, man. Where can people find you on social media to check you out, to follow you on Twitter or Instagram?
Yeah, you can find me at the same handle on my Instagram and my Twitter. It's at Team Egan MMA. And then, of course, you can always find me on Facebook under Tom Egan. But yeah, Instagram and Twitter at Team Egan MMA.
Well, fantastic, Tom. I really appreciate you being here today, and stick around for just a second. And but I just wanted to thank you for that, and hopefully we can have you on again soon.
Absolutely, anytime.